We have with us today Professor Christopher Biggs, a composer and multimedia artist and director of the SPLICE Institute, and professor of composition and technology at Western Michigan University. He wears a lot of hats. He's a great composer, and we're very happy to have him here today. He's going to be presenting to us some of his work in how music intersects technology, and we'll hopefully get to see a bit of his compositional style and some of his works and some of the things he uses to create those works. And I'll remind everyone to mute their microphones. And I'm going to put this into the proper view now so that we will be able to see Dr. Biggs when he chooses. And with that, I will turn it over to Christopher Biggs.
Hello, thanks so much for having me. I'll kind of go through a presentation. Please put questions in the chat. If you're watching live, I'll check out the questions in the Zoom chat. So I'm going to kind of do what Dr. Thompson was just talking about, kind of talk about the work that I do and how it interfaces with technology and show specific technology examples. And I'll try to put in this other thing that I like to weave in, which is thoughts about art and community. So I'll just start kind of by outlining and thinking about what media I use in my work and why. So I use technology in my creative work. So I was trained as a composer, which generally means technology is like a side thing in most composition degrees. But for me, I think if we look around in society and we look at the potential for how music interfaces with people and the diversity of sounds that are possible and also just the potential for interaction, if you're ignoring technology, you're kind of ignoring the most important mechanism for continuing the kind of way that music operates, which is this invisible medium that kind of magically transmits something about human experience that's ineffable through the air, and you can't see it, and it's received on the other end. For me, that's most significant and lovely when it's performed live, and I like live performance. But I use media and technology to enhance and extend live performance capacities because once my head was around the possibilities and once I could kind of started imagining the sound worlds that were possible, and I would just go to write for an instrument and I'd hear something else, I couldn't stop hearing something else that was either similar to that instrument, would extend that instrument, or completely contrary to that instrument. And I think I think George Crumb or somebody is said to have said, I don't know if it's true, like you can get anything that with an acoustic instrument that you can get with electronics. Granted, that's an old quote, pre-dominance of computers, but it's just not true. Technology, you can record every possible acoustic sound and then do something to it. So that is a different size. It's a different quantity of possible sounds. So I use media technology because it extends the sound world. It extends human gesture into performances in a way that's dynamic, interactive, and expressive. However, I can't get over traditional instruments, and I can't get over live human performers. I've tried, but I just keep coming back to them. One thing about traditional instruments is that you have people who are working on becoming a virtuoso through something that we understand why it's impressive. Often with technology, if I'm sitting here with my iPad, right, it could be off and I could be doing whatever. You don't understand if it's impressive or not. It could be impressive, it might not be impressive, and it's hard to link the physical gesture to the outcome in a way that you're like, maybe I could do that, maybe I couldn't, I don't know. But it's culturally encoded from when we're pretty young that, oh wow, like playing violin, that's impressive, right? Playing piano, that's impressive. And I think that adds to the overall sense of what I enjoy about watching someone perform, that what they're doing is impressive, it's singular, it's in the moment. Also, there's phenomenological mind reading, so there's a silly graphic for that. Phenomenological mind reading sounds like some kind of sci-fi thing or something, or maybe from a David Lynch movie, like someone's background. But it's not sci-fi, it's not David Lynch. It just means you can tell what somebody is feeling when you look at them and see how they're emoting. you read the phenomena of their body to get a sense of what they're doing. And unless you're kind of sociopathic, you have mirror neurons, and you see someone smile and you compulsively almost smile in your mind, even if you don't smile with your mouth. And this kind of thing, it transcends and integrates into performance because physical action transmits information and sensibility about the musical expression and adds to our engagement with that musical expression. So Sam Pluta talks about this kind of thing as well, and he tries to when he performs his live electronic sets, if you haven't watched it, I encourage you to go watch it. He kind of engages with that in a way where the way he emotes and his physical actions helps link to the kind of gestural content in the music and the expressive content in the music. Because when you go to hit a piano really hard, it would be super surprising if a quiet sound came out. So it's nice when we build electronic music instruments that have the same kind of capacity, relationship between the gesture, energy trajectory of the performance and the sonic outcome, unless it's intentionally not that way. Meaning like the system is inherently against you, or the system is showing kind of in a humorous way or some kind of extra musical way, some kind of antagonism to your gesture and compared to outcome. Alex Christie is a composer who does this very well. He like loses control of the system and the system works against him during the performance, which is an interesting concept. Okay, so to show kind of a little video of a performance with a scrolling score, this will only be about 30 seconds. I'll show mostly fragments of pieces. If we have time at the end, I'll go ahead and play a full piece. What I'll do is play segments of pieces, and this is just 30 seconds, and it's just to show, like, imagine the difference between watching this person play the cello and its expression versus not seeing the person play the cello and the expression, and if that would be different for you as a viewer. So there's those like subtleties of facial expression and the way that the arm carries tension and all of that kind of stuff that I think communicates something and maps to, extends the expressive content. There's a question in the chat, have I published any papers on phenomenological mind reading and musical performance? I haven't. My brother has published papers on phenomenological mind reading. He's a philosopher. And there's some great research in Canada. I don't want to mispronounce the author's name, but it's like Zatorre, that talks about, there's an amazing article that's like, if music is what we think it is, then it doesn't communicate what we think it does, because essentially the premise goes that what we get visually changes what we hear. And there's a bunch of studies about what we get visually changing what we hear. Some of the more dramatic ones that are easy to demonstrate are like that what you see changes what you hear. You can look up the McGurk effect, and when you watch somebody speak versus close your eyes. But that's more about situations where we're visually versus sonically dominant, as opposed to additional expression carried. But what we see changes what we hear, just like, how you're feeling changes what you hear. The time of day it is changes what you hear. It's really confusing, right? To like mix and master music, and it's like sounds different depending on how you feel and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, fixed media and triggered fixed media. So I started kind of writing acoustic work, and then I started adding fixed media to it, kind of grafting it on. But then I evolved into more triggered fixed media, and I'm going to play examples of both fixed media with a fixed track that the performer has to follow, and triggered fixed media. And then I'll kind of show a system that I use and talk about some of its advantages and disadvantages. So there'll be 2 or 3 pieces in this little clip, and then it's all fixed media or triggered fixed media, and then I'll pull up a little patch and talk about coordinating triggered fixed media. So that second example is a piece for Fixed Media and Wind Ensemble, and it's only about 7 or 8 minutes long, but I didn't feel like it's great to have the conductor have to have a click the whole time, but I also wanted gestural rhythmic interaction to be precise. So I had to think about developing something that would have, hundreds of cues in it, which is pretty frustrating if you're programming your own system. And one thing I'll say now that will come up again later is a lot of the work that I've done in Max and a lot of the live performance work that people do and initial systems that they're making have been challenged over the last 5 or 6 years by what Ableton can just do without hardly any work. And I'll come back to that. If you're not familiar, Ableton Live is kind of like a normal digital audio workstation, except it also has a performance ability. It has kind of effects that are made to run not with low latency, so they're not the highest quality effects, but they're made to just work live really quick. You can drag and drop things. And they integrate it with this specifically designed controller called the Push that is like an amazing, unbelievable instrument. And it's expensive, but when you think about how expensive a piano is and the fact that it only makes piano sounds, suddenly it feels like it's not that expensive to me. But so to get back to this triggered fixed media system, whoops. Sorry, I don't know why it's jumping around. I'll just open it in Max real quick. So to show this triggered fixed media system and kind of what it can do, I'm going to open it in Max MSP.
So I want to interject a minute here and just talk about the experience of being the person that triggers. So we did a piece of Professor Biggs here a few years ago, and I was in charge of pressing the space bar, which you would think would be a not virtuosic task at all, but actually ended up being very challenging to get all the space bar pushes right. But it's an interesting thing that there is a performer in this regard that is in charge of making sure all the cues come in on time. And I thought that was somewhat mildly interesting of like, well, that's a different set of skills you have to just to be able to follow the score well. And when the performer gets lost, to make sure you keep up with where they might have gone was interesting to me. And I also found it interesting, these two different pieces you just played had two different musical representations. One had a more musical notation for the electronic part, kind of looked like Mario Davidovsky. And then the other one had more of a spectrogram component, which showed us kind of what was going on without having to know so much detail in that part.
Yeah. So the first one, the violinist has to follow the whole time, and it's all recordings of violin, and it's not tonal in any traditional sense, but there is kind of underlying tonality with fifths and like kind of modulation moments, and so there's constant underlying, like the lower pitches are kind of tonal and the higher pitches are not. Is kind of how it works out. So to make it followable, I really tried to write out the pitches and I tried to make things very clear. And the other one, I thought it was both pretty to make the score with the spectrogram, and that's the bottom of the score that you were looking at where all the other wind ensemble parts are above that part. And I thought that I'd only put rhythmic information in when the conductor would maybe realize that they were like going too fast or too slow based on that rhythmic information. So that's kind of how I did it. But yeah, it's like a very easy percussion part, but the risk is so much higher than accidentally hitting a snare drum, because you can really ruin something if you hit a cue that's overlapping with 3 other cues, and one of those cues is going for 2 minutes. And then you have to like fumble around and maybe get lost stopping the individual cues, or just cut the whole thing and start again. There's one cue in that piece that we were just listening to that's about 1.5 minutes long, and it's rhythmically important. And so a grad student conductor ended up doing it, and they're like, oh, yeah, it's fine. But then when it always comes down to the rehearsal, it's like super stressful. And you circle all the ones that really matter and things like that, because, yeah, once you hit the button, it's going to happen. It's not like you can like flub a note and be like, try to correct it in a micro fraction of a second. It's just, it's done. All right. Excellent. So then this is kind of a system that I've been working on for this kind of thing that has the following features. You can just send it numbers to play the individual sound files that you load, and it just loads sound files from a folder. And if people have any questions about this, I'm happy to answer. And then also, if you send it cues like serially, like one at a time, then it can do anything in relation to those cues by just typing out lists of messages. So if you see down here, this is this data where it says index, volume, etc. This is the data for the 10 sound files. It's the associated parameters for the files, and like over here is their name and information. You can play them, and I actually don't know what these files are, but I'll play one. All right. And you can play more than one by saying play and then the numbers, stuff like that. But you can also just send lists of messages, like I want some to loop, I want some to play, I want the volume to change, I want the volume to interpolate. So if I do this, oops, sorry, it played it because I hit play. All these are right here, and they all change volume, and they do what they need to do. And same thing here. I don't think this will play any. It just changes those parameters. So when you're developing this kind of thing, I think this is a nice approach, because you can see what the settings are while you're working, and then when you give it away, you can just delete all the information that the person does not need to see, if that makes sense. And again, the goal is just to be able to either have a fixed piece where you move through things serially, or to be able to see the files and kind of live improv with them by drawing on the files and apply all of the time stretching and speed changes and pitch changes that you can to files in real time. There's a question, is this done in vanilla Max or did you use JavaScript? I could have done more of this in vanilla Max, but some of the stuff where I wanted to find a specific folder with a specific name is JavaScript. And then because I did something that I don't, sometimes, like I said, Ableton is kind of a challenge to a lot of what maybe we decide to do in coding languages, because we get excited about doing something. This can be in any number, the sound files loaded can be in any number of channels, and there can be any number of them, and it adapts to all that. So it builds itself based on the numbers you enter. And to do that, it has to be in JavaScript. So it has to have a file that creates the objects when it loads. And the other part that required or was easier with JavaScript is this kind of message sorting in Max, where I wanted to just be able to type the messages in a list, is a pain with objects when you connect them with cables, as you'll have to end up looping things back, holding, testing everything against each other. That's a lot easier in a line-based coding language, where it says, oh, vol all is a keyword to change all the volumes. I know what comes after it is then this. In Max, testing for all that stuff ends up with, I don't know, cable spaghetti is the way I like to think of it, where you're just routing cables around, and then it becomes visually, the great thing about Max is that it's visually explicit, kind of the flow of things, but then you lose that as soon as you need something to loop back around into itself or test, and then you lose the visual, what's visually explicit. And then if you need to make changes, or if you mess up and you don't have time to fix it right then, you might not remember when you go back. So then JavaScript becomes a great solution, unless it needs to be a strictly timed message, in which case you have a problem, because Max is not, does not allow JavaScript messages to be as strictly timed as other messages. All right, so jumping back into the PowerPoint. I also vacillate in kind of how much I want to do with live electronics, meaning there's some kind of source in real time that is either captured for effect application or recording and playback, or there's synthesis in real time, and how much I prefer to do with actually triggered fixed media, because the quality of triggered fixed media is both generally higher and it's more controllable. But then you lose the kind of dynamicism in the moment and the relationship between the performance and the outcome, unless you're going to do if people know the piece by Mark Applebaum, where he plays along as if he's doing it. It's kind of, it's very funny and well done, but you can learn a piece of fixed media and just mime the whole way as if you're performing it. Or you can actually have everything be integrated, or you can have some kind of mix between the two, where some of the magic is contrived and some of the magic is real. But for the audience, either way, it's magic if the performance ends up having that dynamic sense to it of having a live performance. So I vacillate on how much live electronics versus not to use. Generally, I've tended towards more and more and more live electronics because I get to a point where I can do something new and then I just want to challenge myself to do it. And then you do it, and then sometimes there's a sense of reward to that that's very powerful, that you've done something that you didn't necessarily think you could do. And then maybe a year later, there's a sense of regret that you've done so little over the previous year because you were working so hard to do this thing that you couldn't do before. And I think this is true of all of us who are in creative fields or production fields or anything like that. You're constantly trying to figure out how to balance learning new things and moving forward and challenging yourself with just what you can do easily and well in the moment. And yeah, there's a question in the chat. Have you begun implementing elements of improvisation because of the move towards live electronics? There's a few reasons. One of them is personal, which is I have kids, and notating all the music the way that I was and doing all the projects with live electronics and video and all the coding has just become absolutely impossible, but I still want to value the work I do. And also, as everyone's saying, in the time we are in the times that we're in, my time is constricted just like everybody else's, and I feel like I want other types of projects, and live improvisation gives me a way to build tools and then maybe have them apply to more pieces than the way that I had been doing things before. And also it's a way of connection right now because I'm improving online with people. I can do that. I can play music safely in my garage until the weather turns. I'm in Michigan. So it's a way of connecting with people and doing performance and things live where you can do it and you can set it up relatively quickly instead of it being like a year-long project between starting it, writing it all out, working with the performer to refine it, and then having a recording and performance and stuff like that. It's more immediate and it's just fun. Right, so I've been doing more live electronic performance, and in terms of live electronics in pieces I'm writing for others, I've just tended towards having more and more live stuff. In the video that we'll see, the score parts, when something's written out in notation or shown as a waveform, that's a sign that it's an actual fixed media file, as opposed to when it's not written out in notation or something like that, that's a sign that the electronics you're hearing is more likely to be live. And there's kind of a trajectory throughout these pieces of tending more and more towards live electronics. So I'll go ahead and play this clip, and it will have, I think, 3 or 4 pieces that tend towards more and more live electronics compared to fixed media. Yeah, so there's a question about the Splice Ensemble. I'll talk a little bit about Splice music at the end, but also the Splice Ensemble. The Splice music is an organization that involves three components. There's Splice Festival, which is going to happen at University of Georgia in October, and that's like an inter-year conference, like 3 days kind of thing, or 2 days. We do less concerts and more workshops and things like that. And this year it'll be virtual. We do SPLICE Institute, which is a week-long summer program for performers and composers to come together, and we have collaborations on works and whatnot. We always have a guest composer and guest ensembles, and some composers write for those ensembles as well. And it's not just, it's very technical oriented, because again, for many composers, particularly undergrad or even many grad students, composers are often not hired because of their skills with technology. And then there's like one mediocre class about how to mess around with Logic. And then the level of popular music production compared to the level of academic music production is so disparate that it's really embarrassing that we would consider ourselves leaders in electronics as at academic institutions in like a composition field, because you get 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds working in GarageBand that are making music that is better produced than a lot of the music that you get coming out of undergraduate institutions. So we kind of focus both on craft, creativity, so like extending and thinking about things conceptually, and collaboration. And then the fourth thing is community, which I weave in. I said a little bit about it before, about how we have this, I really think that there's something inherent in musical performances, and this is with or without a live performance aspect, where there's something about how sound is invisible and you're trying to decode and encode these abstract relationships over time that just breed empathy, help bring people together. And also when you're doing that, you're not doing other terrible things to the world, which is another good aspect of music. But and also just, there's something about the arts in general, and for me, music in particular, that just makes you wonder and think and find beauty in things that tend to lead you to see the world in a way that might be healthier for yourself and others. But that could all just be, like lying to myself to justify my own existence and what I've chosen to do with my life. But if you believe it too, then you're not lying to yourself. So I'll pretend I'm not either. Okay, system for instrument and live electronics. So in developing more and more stuff with live electronics, I've been developing tools that I try to reuse. I also try to do different things in every piece, like I said, but I might be running out of that kind of desire and more desire to be making tools that I use more, and we'll see how that goes. I also try to give performers a package that's very usable and very organized in its interface design in terms of how a performer might look at it and understand how to go through it. So you'll see in this graphic right here that everything's labeled like number 1, number 2, number 3. And I'll talk a little bit about this piece, and I'll talk about the user interface. So this is a piece that hasn't been played yet, written for Pope Bama, which is a saxophone and percussion duo. And here, I think they're going to use 4 microphones, but they might only use 3. And then I'm not sure if they want to ever like diffuse it and things like that, or maybe they need different output channels on their interface. So I put right away the ability to control it, so they can control that kind of aspect. And I make a help video, so if they don't understand how to do it, then the performer can watch the help video, which is very dry, but still it's there. And then you can open the audio settings. Also, a lot of the effects in the background are all very tempo oriented, because like most effects, they're delay based, or they have some kind of other thing that can be calculated to a tempo. So I give the performer the option to scale the tempo up or down, and that also scales the tempo up or down of any sound file. So there's like rehearsal speed, and then there's regular speed. The sound files sound a little bit worse when you change the tempo from the set tempo, but not noticeably in most live performance environments. I also don't know for sure if it's going to be convenient for them for the percussionist to be on the left or for the saxophonist to be on the left. So when I write this and when I program this, I try to think about what it is to be the person who's going to have to execute this. And then if I have this whole stereo system designed, based on where they sit up. I don't want to just send them a score and be like, this is where you stand, this is where you stand. And that's indefinite in every performance. I want to give them the option to switch that really quickly during the performance. And then I also like to do this, where there's a front end mixer that shows the performer if anything is going badly and gives them the option to mute. Because sometimes in some environments, you just never know exactly what's going to happen, where some frequency range gets out of control and the performer does not have the time to actually sound check it, or the audio engineer is unable to deal with it because you're dealing with 8 pieces or something on a complicated concert. So it's like, okay, that's out of control. I'm just going to kill it so the piece can still happen. So some kind of front end to deal with that. Another thing is I'm always looking when I'm setting up a concert or something, always thinking about what's going on and what I might steal from things. And we have these Mackie speakers that are kind of okay, but pretty cheap. But on the back, they have a button called Feedback Destroyer. And I read the manual on it. I'm like, Feedback Destroyer, that must be amazing. And it turns out it's not that amazing. It works okay. But I'm like, I want a feedback destroyer in my pieces. So my feedback destroyer takes every effect parameter that could get out of control and scales it down, if that makes sense. So like if there's a lot of feedback on effects, which there are in this piece, as you turn that volume up, the feedback percentage goes down, but it doesn't go down linearly. It goes down kind of like this. So that way it's gradual changes to extreme changes. And also any like kind of resonating filter that would resonate frequencies that are already resonant in the space, depending on how much feedback is getting to the microphones in the specific performance environment. All of the gain of any resonating filter scales down. Just trying to think about like, what are the problems in performance and how can I deal with that technically before they have problems in the performance? And then also how to make, what do you keep on the front end for the performer? So that way they don't have to see more than they need to see. And this is already seeing a lot.
This reminds me of when Eleni Lilios came to visit Georgia Southern, and a faculty member asked her, says, well, what do you do if your software fails? And she said, that's not even an option. That can't happen, right? So I'm curious to ask you the same question. What steps do you take that are good advice to people getting into this to ensure that when this actually happens, that we don't have a total disaster?
Yeah, I mean, some of it's unfortunate. Some of it, I think you just have to. It's part of the world that you have to deal with. That there are problems, and it's just part of the world in general, and it's particularly part of the world depending on how trialed the technology is. So if you're not trying your technology a bunch, then you're probably having a greater degree of potential for failure. So that's the one thing. It's like you have to try it over and over. The other thing is like automatic updates and deciding to update at the last minute and having general luck with that is not a sign that you should do it anywhere close to a performance. I think Max in general, because I mostly use Max, is very, very good at keeping things backward compatible and not causing problems. Like they're really good. Like I can open patches in general way back unless they have a major update and they announce like your video stuff isn't going to work the same way anymore, and they make a huge deal out of it. And they're very considerate of that. But not all software is going to be that way. And even with Max, I'm sure that there have been issues, but I get kind of complacent with it. And then I need to check myself. So those are the two main things: is you got to test it a bunch. And then the other thing is that, don't start changing things right towards the end. And then the third thing is, and I think this is almost like a mental outlook. What is absolutely integral to you that has to happen is not necessarily what's going to make the piece work or not for the audience. And that be willing at the last minute to say, okay, this might not happen. I'm not gonna risk everything by jumping into this patch and starting to recode to get this module or something that's not happening, because you're more likely to end up with problems probably in that way. But yeah, I think I like Eleni's outlook, and I wish I could get to that point. But I'm always messing with stuff, and so I take a more tempered view that problems will happen, and so you just try to avoid them through test and trial. And then there's another question: what do you do as a composer if you can't afford health insurance? That's a difficult question. It's a very difficult question for me. I set on a path, and I got relatively lucky to end up on a path where I have an academic job, and I do not have to try to make money on my music, where I can afford external health insurance. So I'm pretty lucky with that. Yeah, and there's moving to a country. There's also, I don't want to get too political, but maybe it's time for a major revolution, maybe, or a restructuring of the economy. That's not just, yeah, but that's a different conversation. But we'll see how that all goes and how things play out. But yes, I got lucky because I think there is a degree of luck, and no matter how good we are, how hard we work, we cannot ignore the fact that if we end up in a position where we're able to make art and do things that we love, it's not just how good you are, it's luck, and you should always be sympathetic and care about other people who don't end up that way. But I'm sorry, I can't give anything else other than that. So this is an example of a utility. I'm interested in making more utilities and actually sharing them, and this is just an example of one. So I have a mixer that builds itself, and it makes n number of channels, channel strips, and every channel strip can be any number of channels. And then it has soloing and muting capacity. I feel like that's a big problem with a lot of people who start working in Macs and coming from a DAW, or working in any programming language and coming from a DAW, is you lose track of where signals are coming from. And I think a front-end mixer is very helpful for that, and it's graphical, and if it has the standard ability to mute and solo, then you can quickly assess what signals are doing what along your chain faster than you can if you don't have that kind of thing. So here's just an example of me building one, because basically for every project I start, I'm like, design how many like systems I'm going to have, how much I want on the front end, and then I just build one of these mixers. And I think this is an old version, but it doesn't have the ability to specify the number of channels, but the new one has the ability to specify the number of channels. And then it's just there, and it works, and you connect stuff in and out from the outside, which is pretty nice. Another thing I'm interested in, I guess people can put in the chat if anybody's used Isotope Neutron, which is a product from the company Isotope. Isotope is an interesting company because they do stuff with like machine learning and other stuff with audio. I think it works well, and I think their effects also sound good. But so to get into the basic concept for people who might not be aware, one thing I've done a lot is amplitude tracking, either a live source or effects on a source or whatever else. So that's tracking the signal over time and averaging out its loudness to create an envelope. And then you can use the loudness of the signal to control other features once you've extracted that data. Right? You can use the loudness of how loud a flute is playing to control the number of attacks, right, of a synthesizer, something like that. So the louder the flute plays, the more aggressive the synthesizer becomes, or any other thing that you can imagine. You can map the loudness of the signal to that thing. I found loudness mapping to be much more effective than pitch mapping, where you're tracking the pitch mapping of something, because in my experience, tracking pitches and applying tracked pitches from a performance, there's a reliability issue, and there's also, it's either kind of pedantic, like you're showing that you're doing it, or it's entirely unlinked and you would never know it's happening. Whereas amplitude mapping, I think, can be expressive, dynamic, and you might not even be aware of it's happening, but once you know it's happening, you kind of hear it, and you feel, even if you don't know what's happening, I guess I would say you feel the relationship between the two things. I would consider this the difference between something being apparent and sensed, so you can kind of sense that relationship. So what Neutron does is it lets you, like if you have a bunch of drum tracks, and if you have drums and you have like vocals, and you realize some part of the drum is covering some part of the vocal, it lets you show that on a spectrogram to see which part is covering which, and actually automate the mixing, so when that part is covering that other part, it goes up and down. I like that. I'm waiting for a DAW to just release something that's similar. It doesn't have to be EQ bands, where every track can report its loudness to every other track, and you can just set up mixing relationships. But that's kind of what I'm doing in the background now of my pieces, is I'm setting up what I'm thinking of as fully matrix amplitude mapping, where any signal in the whole thing can control the level of any other signal. So if one signal gets louder, another signal might get quieter in response, or if one signal gets louder, that another signal might get louder in response. So they either work together or opposite. Also, if I have like 3 instruments and I want all 3 of those instruments, for instance, to hold down a delay, they can hold down a delay, and then it goes, whoop, then it goes up, right? And then they like play, and then the delay comes on. And that's also good for feedback issues, because then there's like this compression downward of how loud the effect is and how much feedback there's until they stop. And then they're no longer putting energy into the system when you hear the thing. So any set of signals from the piece can control the volume of any other signal. So this thing right here is just a graphical interface for that I can put in any effect unit that says you check the signals that you want to control the volume of the effect unit that this is in, and then you can set the compression or expansion, whereby compression causes the signal to get quieter based on the sum of the signals that are impacting it, and expansion causes it to get louder based on the sum of signals that are impacting it. Am I a self-taught programmer? Yeah, I mean, the way that everybody, I think, yeah, I don't like to make too big of claims about being autodidactic, but largely I'm self-taught in my programming, and self-taught in the sense that other people do such amazing work and are so kind on the internet that you can get information about just about anything. And if you ask anybody, generally people just help. And it's pretty neat. I think we're often afraid to ask people about things because we're like, oh, they're fancy, they're busy, or whatever else. But the fact is like, you're really obsessive about something. There's not that many people who want to hear about it, right? And then if someone asks you about it, you're like, yeah, I'll talk to you about that. We do professional development for our composers, and they're often nervous about reaching out to somebody to like interview them or ask them questions. I'm like, people like making connection, and if you're interested in something they're interested in, they are likely to be excited that you're interested in the same thing as them, because I think on a fundamental level, particularly now, we all feel kind of alone and separated, and we look for connection all over the place. And so, yeah, I'm kind of self-taught, but I'm fortunate that generally humanity is pretty good when you just reach out to people or when you look on a forum. And where I teach at Western, I was running into JavaScript trouble this summer, and I just emailed the computer science department, and then like an hour later, somebody's like trying to figure out what I'm trying to do and writing me all these examples. It's nice how people do that. All right, so in this example, fully matrix amplitude mapping, these are 2 pieces. The first one, the piano kind of loudness controls all the amplitudes of the effects. And the second one, all the effects control each other. And the first one is performed by Keith Kirchhoff, who's the pianist for the Splice Ensemble. And the second one is performed by Scott Deal, who's a composer, percussionist, and music technologist. So then I'll talk about the last kind of thing that I've added to my work. Oh, sorry, there's a question. Yeah, pitch organization strategies. It varies by piece. I tend to use a mix of kind of set theory, and sometimes I use rotational systems based on 12 tone and things like that. And I almost always have a tonal underpinning, particularly fifths and half steps at major points. And I like a kind of a global pitch organization where if we're dealing with sets or something that's rotational, like a kind of 12 tone like, or that there's morphology, that there's changes that are directional, and that things tend to resolve and open and close. So avoid what is often called or thought of as like grayness when you're not doing that kind of thing. So if I'm using like 12 tone, I might write a whole nother part underneath that's relatively tonal, kind of fits and matches, or only picks pieces out that's tonal, like people have done before. And if I'm using sets, I'll often morph the sets over time to open and close. And in that piece, it ends up and often I'll use the instrument itself to think, and this is partly I think because of being a guitar player. Playing guitar, you want everything when you're young, right? You want everything to be in E, and then you realize you can do drop D, and it's like, oh, that's awesome. And then you want everything to be in D because it's like the lowest note, and it feels so good if that's tonic. I often extend that to the instruments I write for. So like in that vibraphone piece, the tonic is F because that's the lowest note on the instrument, and it has the highest note as well. So I often think about what might feel good or might the instrument itself suggest as a kind of a rival pitch. What instruments do I play? I'm developing a live electronic system with this. I think this is the thing I most play, and I'm learning how to play the push. I grew up playing some piano, but I had an injury I couldn't really reach, continue to play. Played saxophone. And I played a lot of guitar, and I was pretty good at guitar, but I don't practice any instrument anymore other than interfacing with the computer to make sound. And I'm hoping to get good enough at these electronic music instruments that I'm programming that I will consider myself a performer, but I think I'm a few stages away from wanting to make that claim. Which brings me to an aside about Ableton. Oh, sorry, I skipped this part, and I think I'll skip the part on Ableton, actually. So I do video in my work, and I've kind of scaled this back, like I've said, largely because of reasons of time. I'll play two pieces. The first one has a fixed media video, and the second one is, or three, and the second two are interactive videos. And I really like video, and I like pieces with live instruments, but that creates an inherent conundrum that I haven't gotten around, where you have the visuals and then you have the person executing the thing on stage. And I also think that the person executing the thing on stage is a visual object. And then I'm okay with postmodern multi-perspectivalism, or whatever you want to call it, whereby the listener gets unique experiences based on choice, but I'm also really into form, and I want a specific thing to follow around. I think I got into video because of how abstract audio is. And I want to like say something specific sometimes. And usually that's like some kind of extra musical, like political statement or something like that I really want in my work. But I think I've come to the point to realize now that I decided to go into music, and I didn't decide to pursue my undergraduate activism for my life. And because I've made that decision, I can't have every piece communicate something as specific as if I had gone a different direction in my life. So I'm constantly trying to balance this extra musical content desire with actually what is communicable. And I always want the fundamental expression to be slightly abstract and to be more like a journey, not to say something. And once you introduce video, it can be entirely abstract, but you can also introduce very specific things. And so I think it's a constant balance for many people who are inspired to create artwork in relationship to personal experiences and the experiences of others and how we personally interrelate to them. And then we go to do that, and then the content is lost in the translation, and then where does that leave us, and how does that really matter what we thought, and then what is the purpose? And I always, if you have to read like a book to try to understand what someone is saying musically, then maybe the book was the art object. So it's I'm leaving this all as questions. because I don't know, but I'll play some video work I did in relation to pieces, some of which is abstract and some of which is not. So we all already kind of hit this aside about Ableton a little bit, but I think like other academic electronic music composers spend time valuing and creating and figuring out their own tools. And then every once in a while, you know, I'll see students that I have who like do EDM or DJ, and they're doing something that is really good and they're doing it in a fraction of the time. And the actual tools that I need are similar to the tools that they need. And I think Ableton is one of those tools. And there's a few video ones now, too, that I've seen younger people using that just do the kind of things that I'm interested in, often a lot faster. I always run into problems with Ableton where, like, I can't do something, and then I end up jumping back to Max, except for the piece that you just saw, where I decided to actually make it be in Ableton. But the issue with Ableton is that there's not a easy, well, one of the issues with Ableton for me is when you send an Ableton thing to a performer, you have to kind of send a whole help video about the DAW unless you cover up the DAW itself. So I spent a little bit of time trying to cover up the DAW and just have it be more like a piece that's written in Max for Ableton. So for people who don't know Ableton, it's a digital audio workstation that allows for live performance, and then it also they bought Max MSP, and they've integrated Max even before they bought them under the hood. So you kind of get a front-end digital audio workstation and let me make sure the volume's down so that way we're not getting live processing on my voice. A front-end digital audio workstation with a kind of the ability under the hood to program whatever you kind of want in a Max-like way. So I think this kind of shows that this right here is kind of a simple, normal Max-like way of moving through scenes, of moving through steps, you know, going through a piece. And then it has the kind of things I talked about earlier in terms of fixed media, whereby you can set the tempos to the piece. And when I actually set these tempos, I don't know how well you can see, but over here are the names of each cue, kind of. And when you set the tempo, right, the name of each cue actually changes to that tempo name, so that way when you play, Ableton actually launches that scene at that tempo. So it's kind of a mixture of the fixed media triggering things I was talking about earlier with an Ableton front end interface, and the Ableton front end interface makes signal flow and adding effects and all that kind of stuff way easier than doing it in Max. And then I think there are solutions to maybe getting around some of the difficulty for the performer of having to open this thing that's really alien, whereas in Max you can give them a very nice graphical environment. The other thing is you can develop utilities for Ableton, like the ability to just turn on and off the gain and have the effects muted or not muted, because you can program stuff. And then Ableton comes with a bunch of Max for Live devices. I feel like I'm advertising for Ableton, but to be clear, I'm problematizing what I've chosen to do with my life in relation to something that may have been an easier solution, because I find that many people in my field get antagonistic to Ableton. I'm not trying to advertise for Ableton, but yeah, you can program underneath the hood in Ableton, and you can get it to do, I think, a lot of things that Max does a lot quicker. Okay. Excellent. So we already talked about that. So if there's any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. You can also feel free to email me. I didn't play any complete pieces, but my website is right here. I have complete pieces up on my website of almost everything I've done, and everything that I don't have on my website that I've recorded is available through streaming services. And then one more mention of splicemusic.org and what we do. So we kind of value the combination of more traditional performance with electronics in addition to more experimental electronic music performance. And we try to, develop community through our summer program that helps people focus on, again, craft, collaboration, and community. Bring people together where they develop relationships that can transcend outside that experience and keep people invested. Because like I was saying earlier, I think we all seek and desire community over isolation, and that when we develop and work on systems collaboratively to make those kinds of things, we're more likely to have sustainable careers in the arts, even if it's just people that you're more likely to be comfortable telling how you really feel and how hard the present moment is for you, or something like that. Just people that you hear, and you develop real relationships by finding people who have shared interests and then establishing community around those things. So if there's no other questions.
Well, I thank you very much for this. Is a great presentation, and I'm looking at what you have as the background there, and I'm thinking about when I heard the album you put out and how good that album sounded. And I thought again about the many hats that someone like you has to wear, that you also have to have some skills in just regular old music technology, just recording things well and knowing how to do that. I think you do that really well. How did you learn how to do that?
So I was fortunate that my brother's friend had a 4-track, and they were going to make a band, and so I was like 12 and I got to start using a 4-track, and I just got to experiment with things. And then I felt after I got my doctorate and I had no degrees focused on music technology, I got a job at a community college teaching full time in a audio engineering program, which I was not prepared for. So I learned. And now, I mean, I teach composition, but my composition, I have like 5 or 6 students a semester, and then I teach 3 classes, and that's all. Most of the students in those classes are what we call multimedia arts technology majors. And I feel like that's the majority of what I owe is technology and experience with that. So I set up projects for myself that require me to improve in ways that will help students. So I try to mix my creative work that I want to be doing to the teaching load, and I try to make that match the things I feel like I should be offering students.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you in a sense that being a teacher is often being the best student over and over and over again. Is constantly learning things. Um, but yeah, I mean, all your work's very impressive. I'm very glad you were able to share it with us, because I think that people here in this Zoom meeting and online will be inspired by what they hear with instrument and electronics, because you are one person who's one of the best at doing it right now, in my opinion, and it shows. So congratulations for all of that.
Thank you very much.
Yep. Well, with that, I think I'm going to pass off to students. If they have any questions, feel free to chime in. Or professors. Everything's so crystal clear.
I, I do have a question. I was seeing on your Spotify page that you have an album there. Can you tell us a little bit about that album?
Yeah, yeah. So it's called Decade Zero, which is a climate science reference, and it's all instruments and electronics. Some of them are live, some of them are fixed, and it's very distinct projects. But many of the pieces I did over an extended period of time had to do with some aspect of climate change or social justice in association with climate change, in terms of their actual musical content. And that's kind of what binds it together. There's different performers on all the pieces, and they were recorded over a relatively long amount of time. And some of them, got recorded in amazing ways, using, like having to cut out the cars driving by and stuff like that. But yeah, it was really fun to make. Do you have a more specific question about it? I don't know if I'm answering or in the direction you're
No,
heading.
I was just wanting to get like a picture of what was I going to listen because I do want to listen to it, but I just wanted to have a little bit of a preliminary explanation of what it is about.
Yeah, so that's kind of the extra musical content, but it holds as just abstract music, and there's very little semiotics, meaning there's very little sounds that are directly representational, except like water sounds, in association with environmentalism and things like that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. With that, I think we've covered enough ground. And again, I thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it. And thank everyone for being here to join us and hear what Professor Biggs has to say with words and music. And with that, I'm going to end this meeting. So goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.